The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
Mark Weitzman. I'm Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. It involves working as sort of liaison with the State Department, with various international bodies such as the UN, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a 57-member group that deals with both security and human rights issues, and also with a number of, with a lot of European governments through organizations such as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is 31 countries and is the only international body that deals specifically and just with the Holocaust and with anti-Semitism. So it is a very interesting and in some ways important address these days to deal with those subjects. A few words on IRA, because I think it's important and in many ways almost totally unknown, which is sadly totally unknown. It was set up about 15 years ago, grew out of an initiative of the US and the Swedish Prime Minister, among others. There were two forums in Stockholm in 2000, 2001, which led to the creation of this body. And again, it also grew out of some of the work, the international pressures about recovering hidden assets in the late 1990s. And this was sort of the educational offshoot of some of those efforts. And the idea was to create an international body that dealt with Holocaust education, research, and remembrance, and have that body composed of both experts, academics and experts on the subject, as well as diplomats. So it had official government sanction and recognition, but it also involves people who supposedly know the subject and work on the subject as well. And it has grown from 5 or 6 countries since its beginning to 31 now, with about another 5 or 6 in various stages of application to get in. It has international partners such as the UN and other international organizations. And it has a number of efforts that it's been successful in helping. For example, it was one of the groups that helped spearhead the opening of the last European archive on the Holocaust in Bad Arolsen in Germany, which had been under the International Red Cross control and had been closed until international pressure brought it open. With the exception of the Vatican, that was the last major European archive of that period that had not been open. So that, for example, is one of the successes that it contributed to. It's composed various educational guidelines dealing with the subject, which have been accepted internationally and by a lot of individuals and groups working on the Holocaust in countries. Again, a significant achievement. The problem is right now that this group is facing, I think, 2 crises. One is that there is the chair for this group rotates annually from different countries. So depending on a country's attitude toward the Holocaust and how the Holocaust should be portrayed and towards anti-Semitism, you get more active or more passive or more political aspects entering into it. And the second is that right now Europe is facing a major crisis and of anti-Semitism and other issues, and the group is a little bit overwhelmed by some of the challenges facing it, and frankly needs more resources and more attention paid to it. The European, when we think about Europe's attitude to the Holocaust, most of us would assume that after 1945, Europe would have said the Holocaust was such an important watershed event. It reshaped our borders. It shaped our national demographics. It changed our whole world. We had to have learned from it. Something important happened there. It helped create the EU, for example, and then the UN and all these international bodies. And the reality is that more often than not, in some ways, lip service was paid for it in various countries. There is no real monolithic European reaction today. You have the Western countries, for example, significant differences between France, Germany, and Austria. The Germans probably came the closest to recognizing their responsibility and making it a part of the national historical consciousness and working on it. And that took decades to do. It was not until the late 1960s, early to 1970s that they really began to face up to it. It took the Austrians another couple of decades, and they haven't really measured up to what the work that the Germans have done, but they've come a long way in the post-wartime era. It basically took wartime to raise that as an issue that the Austrians confronted. In France, you had different layers as well. Chirac finally apologized for some of the activities a number of years ago, but the French attitude was embodied for years with the idea that everyone was in the resistance. We were all opposed to the Germans. The Dutch had the myth of Anne Frank, and when I say myth, meaning that they basically took that and made that the hallmark of the Dutch Holocaust memory, and for example did not deal with the fact that there were one of the highest collaboration rates in Western Europe came from the Netherlands. So there, and that doesn't even begin to approach Eastern Europe, where you had the communist era, which politicized the Holocaust took out the Jewish aspect of it in many ways and made it into a anti-fascist propaganda tool. And so when these countries emerged from communism, they were decades behind Western historiography and Western attitudes. That is one of the factors that the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, first began working on, was to try to take the benefits of the Western historiography and historical approaches to the Holocaust and partner with emerging countries out of Eastern and Central Europe who were emerging from communist depression, and basically help them to investigate and come to grips with the past related to that. But today we see different issues in those countries. We see in Hungary, for example, a political aspect of perhaps diverting the Holocaust or distorting the Holocaust in a certain way to support an existing political narrative. We see that in some of the Baltic countries as well. So there are very distinct approaches. If you look at it in a broad sense, the Holocaust has become a European signifier, meaning that every European country pays lip service to it. I sat in the United Nations last December when the General Assembly had a day of a special meeting on anti-Semitism. And invariably, all the European countries that came up, they had 3 minutes to speak, and they all gave a condemnation of anti-Semitism, and then immediately segued into talking about what they're doing in terms of Holocaust education. On one hand, that sounds great. On the other hand, as I pointed out a number of times going back a number of years, there are dangers with that. The Holocaust is not necessarily the answer for current anti-Semitism today. There was a survey taken in the UK, just released I think about a month ago, maybe or a couple of weeks ago, where they have a very strong Holocaust education program. And it turned out that the results of the survey were disheartening in many ways. Students knew about the Holocaust, but they didn't draw lessons from it. They didn't know, for example, that they blamed Hitler. They didn't blame everyone who participated. The bulk of the German nation, then the local collaborators, and I'm not talking about only direct collaboration, but the apparatus, let's say, of genocide. They couldn't recognize that. They didn't draw the inference to anti-Semitism today. They had difficulty with that. So there are significant gaps that exist even after intensive Holocaust teaching. And if you go in other countries, in other areas, you can find a number of ways the Holocaust is distorted. One of the things that IRA has done that I think is very significant was a few years ago, about 3 years ago or so, in its meeting in Toronto, it passed a working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, which I worked on for 5 years. I was the lead author of that. I worked on for about 5 years, and it was important for a couple of reasons. One, it's the first time an international body has ever tried to formally accept a definition related to Holocaust denial, and it was accepted by the 31 countries. It's a working definition, which means it's not legally binding, but it has political influence, and it does not call for any censorship, or we didn't go into down that path. We just kept it as what we saw as the issue was. But it's most important was it dealt with the issue of distortion as well. So you could not have a situation as you have in certain countries, and we can get more specific as we go along, where the Holocaust has become a tool of current political reality. We sometimes get the question of why people are still interested in pursuing and bringing to justice the Nazis who are now in their late 80s, 90s, or whatever. And I think it still is important on a certain level. First of all, it sends a message. Simon Wiesenthal used to say, and he said it to me, and he said it many times publicly, that one of the successes of his life, in a sense, was thinking that somebody someplace may be deterred by thinking that, even after 40, 50 years, someone is going to come after me and I won't get off scot-free, and maybe I shouldn't be participating in this war crime or act of genocide. Maybe I should think twice about it because I know that the pursuit is going to continue. So there's that element. Secondly, there's an element of establishing the historical record. Going through court, establishing, giving victims their voices, establishing who did what to who, when and where. These are all still important parts of a record that we have many, many, many pieces put together, but far from all of them. There are still unknowns, there are still gaps. We still don't know the names of many victims. We still don't know sometimes where they're buried. We still don't know who the perpetrators were in terms of accomplices and in terms of colleagues. And going to a court of law, going through the process, both the building up the evidence beforehand and then establishing it successfully, are very important endeavors that create a message, both that we're not going to forget about this, we want to set a precedent for the future, and we want to flesh out exactly what happened, and especially with the victims, give them voice and give them a memory. The recent trial of the man who was called the accountant of Auschwitz was basically a trial. It was actually interesting because he didn't, unlike others, he did not deny his presence at Auschwitz. He admitted to being there. He said that, and the evidence appears to be that he did not participate in acts of physical violence, including murder, but he was a bookkeeper, an accountant, an office worker. But that is still, I think, an important part of the substructure of the Nazi crimes, of genocide, of mass murder, because it wasn't just the people who pulled the trigger. Eichmann, for example, was much more of a bureaucrat than anything else. He was not a frontline warrior any means. Yet the shuffling of paper, the arranging of train schedules, as Claude Lanzmann masterfully pointed out in Shoah, the technical logistical detail had to be mastered to bring people to the point of someone pulling the trigger or someone pushing them into a gas chamber or into a mobile killing van. And even an accountant played a role. And so I accept that the man stood up and acknowledged his presence there and spoke about a moral guilt, but went beyond the moral guilt. It was important that he made that statement, I think, for people to hear and to know that Auschwitz really occurred, that some participants were there, are able to acknowledge what really happened there, because there are still people who would have to deny or distort that in today's world. But I think it was also important that the court sent a message that you were part of the apparatus. You played a role, and that role needs to be recognized and judged. There's a core of hardcore Holocaust denials. You mentioned Arthur Butts, for example. He used to teach electrical engineering at Northwestern. Most of these were not historians. Most of these were not trained in any of the relevant fields. And essentially, they still exist. There's a small center of Holocaust denial in the United States. David Irving, the British denier, is the most famous, perhaps, in the world today. But they've essentially been marginalized. The wealth of evidence that has come pouring out, whether documentary film, archival, the court trials, the archives that have opened up in Eastern Europe and so on, and even in former Soviet Russia, have added immensely to the pool of knowledge that we have. The governments that have acknowledged the Holocaust and have taken steps to it. So in the West, Holocaust denial to a certain extent has been marginalized on the extremes of the neo-Nazis like David Duke or the professional anti-Semites like David Irving and so on. And again, the noteworthy was the Irving trial in London, where he basically failed in his attempt to claim that the American historian Deborah Lipstadt had libeled him by calling him a Holocaust denier and anti-Semite. The evidence proved clearly otherwise and totally discredited Irving from any attempt at respectability moving forward. What you do have are efforts in the West to, and I use this phrase, to distort the Holocaust. So I'll give you an example, a concrete example. Hungary is a country with a very conflicted approach to the Holocaust in many ways. Currently they're chairing that International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which means that the government is putting its weight behind efforts, positive efforts towards Holocaust education and research and remembrance. And yet at the same time, there are a number of controversial elements that have gone on in Hungary, also government supported. The most recent, for example, is there's a statue proposed in a city in Hungary to a man named Homan, Balint Homan, who was a prominent historian in the early 20th century in Hungary and was a leading politician who was a member of the Arrow Cross government, the collaborationist government, introduced some of the first anti-Semitic legislation into parliament, and some of the funds for that statue are channeled or coming from one of the national ministries. And there's still a controversy over whether they want it built or don't want it built. They're claiming they don't want it built. They don't approve of the statue. On the other hand, they haven't stopped the funds, that they haven't intervened on it. And this was a message that if the statue was put up, it will glorify one of the chief figures, anti-Semitic figures, of the Hungarian nation during the World War II period. Two writers that have been accused of anti-Semitic writing, and one of them at least was a collaborator, have been inserted into the national curriculum. There was a major controversy. As a result of some of the controversy, and this was international, in other words, some of the IRA, for example, that I mentioned, put pressure on, among others, that context was supposed to be put in with these writers, where their background and their political views are supposed to be explored along with the literary work that they did. If it had not been for that pressure, they would have been put in as members of the pantheon of Hungarian literature. So you see a very conflicted approach, but none of that is denying the Holocaust. Hungary has a law that criminalizes outright denial of the Holocaust. So at the same time that you have a government that is, in some ways, is actually one of the most egregious parts of it would be a preamble to the Constitution that essentially states that Hungary bore no responsibility for anything that happened from the time of the Nazi invasion in takeover in 1944 to the end of Soviet or the communist era governments. The bulk of Hungarian Jews, over 450,000 Jews, were deported in that period after the Nazis came in 1944. That deportation was organized by Eichmann with a unit that numbered no more than 150 people, let's say. You cannot deport 440,000 with 150 people. There had to be massive collaboration. And that doesn't even count the shootings on the banks of the Danube, for example, that were attested to and witnessed to. And yet this preamble, in essence, takes total responsibility out of that and puts it in the hands of the Germans. And so there was a statue that was proposed by the Hungarian government that was put up in one of the major squares, diagonal to the U.S. Embassy, as a matter of fact, that showed the figure of Hungary, national figure, with a German eagle sort of on top of it, as if signifying that Germany had basically conquered Hungary and forced it to do its will during World War II. The fascinating thing about that is the Hungarian people, in Budapest at least, created a monument right in front of that, a low memorial where if you go to Budapest right now, and I've been there 4 times in the last 6 months or so, you will see they put out pictures, photos of Jews wearing yellow stars, of Sidurim, of Jewish prayer books, and so on. And they created their own People's Memorial to say that we are not forgetting who the victims were, that we are not allowing Hungary to cast itself as the victim when the true victims were the people who were murdered. And they created, right in front of it, a People's Memorial that is still there right now. So you see that there's this really conflicted national battle for historical memory and accuracy. But all that, none of that is denial. It deals with distortion more than anything else. Well, Austria is a similar case in a sense in that it also had a history of a questionable historical memory. For years, the Austrians worked off the Cold War reality, which was that Austria was declared neutral at the end of World War II, right between the Iron Curtain and the Western countries. And it was almost a bidding war, so to speak, for who was going to get Austria to join its sphere of influence. And one of the things the Allies promised, the West promised, was to treat Austria as a victim nation, to take the Anschluss, when Hitler came in 1938, to take that as a sign of occupation. Unfortunately, that neglected the historical reality that he was welcomed overwhelmingly by the Austrians. The footage that we have, the statistics, the numbers, showed that Austria was not an occupied country. Austria was significantly willing to join the occupiers. And as a matter of fact, the percentage of Austrians in the SS were greater than that of Germans, for example. Adolf Eichmann was born in Austria, as just to take one isolated example. But that bargain meant that Austria could create a level of historical amnesia for years. That finally blew up when Kurt Waldheim, the former Secretary General of the UN, was exposed to having a Nazi past. Simon Wiesenthal, who had lived in Austria all his life after liberation from Mauthausen, had a very lonely life in Austria. He was threatened, he was sued a number of times. He ended up having to have a libel case with the Chancellor of Austria, Kreisky, who accused him of collaborating with the Nazis. After Kreisky left office, he lost that case. Kreisky was a Jew with very ambivalent feelings towards his Jewishness. Kreisky was the person who legitimized Yasser Arafat to European leaders. Kreisky wanted to appoint a man named Peter, I forget his first name, to his cabinet, and Wiesenthal exposed Peter as having an SS background, which led to a massive political scandal. Kreisky accused Wiesenthal of collaborating. After that happened, after Kreisky finally left office, because he was exempt while he was in office, he was found guilty of libeling Wiesenthal for that claim. But Kreisky was an anti-Zionist Jew who was very, very ambivalent, to put it nicely, about his Jewishness. And so all that fit into it. So the Waldheim case blew the lid off all that. And there is a generation of Austrians that had since really tried to work on it, to grapple. They've made strides. Mauthausen is now a national memorial. There are Austrian educators I know who do excellent work on the Holocaust. There are people in the government bureaucracy who do some good work. They've done a lot of restitution. But you saw, I don't know if you had the chance to see the film Woman in Gold, but some of the attitudes expressed there by some of the establishment people, which was a number of years ago, were not very favorable to this woman who was trying to recover her heritage. And they symbolized, in essence, an attitude that many Austrians had grown up with, which is that we were victims, we don't want to hear about anybody else. The question of what we call looted assets is still one it's an open question right now. And in some ways, this is one of the hot button issues that we deal with, because the late 1990s saw a surge in attention paid to this, and there were some national approaches, the French, the Swiss, and so on, under tremendous pressure, issued reports and did things. The U.S. did as well, about what happened to assets that were looted. But significant areas are left untouched. And in many cases, they still make it extremely difficult or impossible for people to recover assets that were in the family for generations. This is particularly the case with art, for example, where paintings that are now extraordinarily valuable are hanging in many museums. And by the way, some of the museums in the US, I think, have questionable pieces of art as well. Even more so are the question of property. And there you have an issue that is very complicated, because particularly in the Eastern European countries, a lot of the property was nationalized at certain point, and it went through stages. If it was taken from the Jews, it was then given a lot of times to local collaborators. And so when it was nationalized by the communists, whether local communists or Soviet or Russian communists or so on, the laws that were passed afterwards sent the properties back to the former owner. But the former owner was not the original Jewish owner. The former owner, many times, was the local person who profited from the confiscated property. That has raised a political issue that has made it extremely difficult in certain places to get property back. I know negotiations have been going on with Poland for years. I've had U.S. diplomats tell me for years that we're on the verge of a breakthrough, an agreement with Poland that'll be ratified by the Sejm, the parliament in Poland. I don't think we're still there. It's still going on. There were a couple of attempts. There was a meeting of 47 countries in Prague a couple of years ago that created something called the Terrorism Declaration and the European Shoah Legacy Institute, which was supposed to deal with that, and that has really pretty much fallen apart, that effort. The Baltic countries, there are significant issues of property. There's a controversy right now over the building of a proposed building over part of what appeared to be an old Jewish cemetery in Vilnius. That has even divided the Jewish community. It's divided the religious Jewish community are divided over that. So the issue is not a simple issue. It apparently is one where in many cases there are just a lot of low pressure on the local level to make it as difficult as possible for Jews who are sometimes seen as rich foreigners living in the West to come back and reclaim the homes, the apartments, the buildings that once belonged to them. Switzerland was one of the countries that faced a lot of scrutiny in the late 1990s, mid-1990s, whatever, before the turn of the millennium. And it took an immense amount of international pressure before the Swiss finally agreed to commission a report. They had eminent historians and distinguished people, I forget exactly what they called the commission, put together a report on it. And the Swiss have, in some ways, attempted to negotiate the strict Swiss banking laws and privacy laws and so on and so forth with the international pressure to give money back to people who it belonged to. And they've managed to work out enough of an approach that they've taken themselves off the front burner, meaning that most people seem to be fairly satisfied on general terms. I'm not going to say on specific terms with what's happening in Switzerland. If I looked at major issues right now in the West, for example, in France, there was a major issue that was settled just about a year ago or so with the French railroad system, which was responsible for deporting many Jews. And I think, if I recall correctly, maybe even had charges included in that. And they've just made a massive acknowledgement and settlement. But that may end up being a precedent for other areas where transport was also a matter of collaboration. So we move from the level of necessarily sometimes the individual bank holder, account holder, to the corporate level of the of transportation and perhaps other industries that collaborated in certain ways. So the investigation is still ongoing. And again, we have to be clear about it. The corporations that exist today, even if they have the name of the corporation, whether it's Bayer or IG Farben or one of those kind of firms, are generally owned by different people. Certainly have different employees these days, because if you just look at the age of the people then would not be functioning today. And while they have a corporate responsibility and an historical responsibility, the individuals today, unless they try to cover it up, unless they really try to obstruct the history and to deny it, are not the ones who are responsible for what happened in 1944, let's say.
Welcome to another Leon Charney report, and what a report we have tonight. Tonight we have Efraim Zuroff here, who's written a book called The Last Chance, Operation Last Chance. If you don't know about him, he's a Nazi hunter, like Simon Wiesenthal was, who came from Austria. I never understood why I never moved to Israel. I'll ask Efraim. If you remember Efraim, he was on my show years ago. He wrote a very good book about the Vad Hatzalah, which was a Jewish organization during the Second World War, which brought Jews out of Nazi Germany and other occupied places. But it was pretty tricky and political, and it was a great book. I don't know if it's been a bestseller or not, but probably should be a movie. How many Nazis are left, Effie?
Well, you'd be surprised.
I wouldn't.
First of all, if you take into account the fact that the Holocaust took place in about 20 different countries,
right.
The Nazis made a very serious effort in every single country to recruit local help. And that's for two reasons, ideological reasons and practical reasons. Ideological, to prove that everyone supported their plan to mass murder the Jews. Practical, that obviously every local person enlisted or recruited meant that they could free a German or Austrian for use elsewhere. And of course, if Jews were trying to pass or trying to hide, it was obviously much harder to fool a German from Hamburg, an Austrian from Vienna, than to fool their neighbors. So hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these people helped the Nazis, and in certain areas of the world they actually played a very, very important role.
So you're
in the mass
chasing
murder.
Conspirators with the Nazis also?
Not only, in other words, certainly German and Austrian Nazis,
right.
but also their Eastern European collaborators.
The German government help you at all?
German government doesn't help us, but if we find people who can be brought to justice, Germany is one of the countries where they're still putting Nazis on trial. And about 3 weeks ago, a trial was opened in Aachen of a SS hitman in the Netherlands named Heinrich Bora, who was number 6 on our most wanted list. And we pressed for his prosecution, which, as I said, opened 3 weeks ago. And in Munich, John Ivan Demjanjuk is awaiting trial November 30th.
You know, I had Tzvi Malkin, I forgot his name.
Tzvi Malkin.
Tzvi Malkin. He captured Eichmann. I had him on his show a few times. He was a great artist. He died about 3 or 4 years ago. He won 2 medals from the president of Israel for Mossad work, which he did, which he could never really talk about. He was lionized, by the way, and he told us about it, but we never spoke about it. Now he's dead. We can say that he really was a great guy. Anyway, his parents or his family were wiped out by, and he had to arrest Eichmann in, it was Argentina.
Buenos Aires.
Buenos Aires, in Argentina. And he described it, you know. I said, didn't you feel like you wanted to kill him right there on the spot? And he said, no, I started to talk to this guy, you know, and you know the whole story.
Yeah, sure.
There were books written about it, and they got him out. Abba Eban at that time got a plane from El Al, and they took him out. It was a big scene in Israel. I think it was made into a movie also.
Yeah.
And so Nazi hunting has been going on a long time. Now, Simon Wiesenthal was I would say the premier Nazi hunter, and you're working for a center that's named after him. There was another fellow we had on from Haifa who was also a Nazi hunter. Tuvia Friedman. Is he still alive?
He's still alive, but he's not active.
He's not hunting?
No, not hunting anymore, no.
All right.
I'm the last one out there.
You're a graduate of Yeshiva University with a whole pedigree over there. How did you become a Nazi hunter?
I was the right person at the right time in the right place. I had a degree in Holocaust studies.
Oh, really?
I was from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I was working, I'd come to Los Angeles to be the first academic director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center at the time when the US government started prosecuting Nazi war criminals here. And before I went back, I suggested to the OSI, the Office of Special Investigations, that I work for them as a researcher in Israel, and they agreed. And I worked there for 6 years until I devised a technique to use refugee records to track down Nazi war criminals. And ones I found had emigrated all over the world. And I went back to Rabbi Haya, and I suggested to him
Haya's the director of the Institute.
Of the Wiesenthal Center, that the center make a final push to try and convince other governments like Australia, Canada, and Great Britain, where, just like the United States, many thousands of Eastern European Nazi war criminals had emigrated, posing as refugees, to make a push to convince them that they had to take legal action against them and to set up offices like the OSI. And that effort yielded the names of hundreds and hundreds of suspects, which helped convince those countries to pass special laws to allow prosecution. Canada in 1987, Australia in 1989, UK in 1991, all passed special laws enabling criminal prosecution in those countries.
Now, do you have a definition of exactly what a Nazi was or a Nazi collaborator was that you really are chasing? Or are you taking a person who was a member of the, not the German army, let's say?
No, definitely not. We're talking about people who actively participated in the persecution and murder of innocent civilians during World War II in a German uniform or as a German collaborator.
Now, do you chase them if they kill gypsies also?
Of course. Some of the people, listen, I'll give you an example. Perhaps one of the most important cases that we were successful in, and this is described in the book, was a case of a man named Dinko Šakić, who was the commandant of the Jasenovac concentration camp in Croatia.
It would take me 10 years to memorize these names. How do you get those names?
I work on it. It's a camp where at least 90,000 people were killed, mostly Serbs, 18,000 Jews, Roma, Gypsies, and anti-fascist Croatians. And we found him, we exposed him in Argentina, in Santa Teresita, and we worked very hard to have him extradited to Croatia, where he was put on trial, was sentenced, given the maximum prison sentence, 20 years, and died in prison. So in his case, the majority of his victims were non-Jews. But we don't discriminate.
That's good. Do you get help from other sources other than Jewish sources for your funding?
Yes. As a matter of fact, a lot of the people who help me in different countries all over the world are non-Jews. And for example, I have two young teachers in Budapest who are members of the Faith Church, very strong supporters of Israel, and very involved in Holocaust education. And I don't speak Hungarian, so anytime I have any problems in Hungary or I have to do some undercover work in Hungary, they're out there to do it for me.
Do you have any security issues?
Well, I had a price put on my head in Croatia when I exposed a man by the name of Milivoj Ašner, who was the police chief of a city called Slavonska Požega, and who had personally orchestrated the destruction of the Serb, Jewish, and Gypsy communities of that city, sending hundreds of innocent people to be murdered in Ustasha concentration camps. A extremist emigre group of Croatians put a price on my head, but they put 3 times as much money on the head of the Croatian justice minister and twice as much on the head of an NGO who helped us. So I was also a little insulted, I have to say.
Maybe it was in shekels and they devalued.
Dollars.
Dollars very weak.
Yeah.
They got to pay you.
It was a little stronger when they put the price on my head.
All right, so you write this book. It's one man's quest to bring, okay, we know that, but I haven't read the book yet, I must tell you. So when I start to read this book, you say it's written like an intrigue, like a drama, a fictional drama. What are you doing in this book? What's the premise of your book?
Okay, what I'm doing is the following. I'm telling the history of the last 35 years of bringing Nazis to justice. And there are 2 very important developments that explain why today we're still hunting Nazis, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. 64 years after the end of World War II, and we're still at it. So the 2 developments were the discovery that thousands and thousands of Eastern European Nazi collaborators who played a very important role in the final solution emigrated to the Anglo-Saxon democracies, primarily the US, Canada, Australia, and UK, posing as innocent refugees. That discovery was first made in the United States in the mid-70s, and later in Canada, Australia, and the UK. And as I explained, those countries passed laws enabling prosecution. The second important development was the breakup of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism, which created a situation in which the post-communist world, those countries of Eastern Europe, for the first time, were in a position to face their Holocaust past. And in that context, you have to note that the collaboration in Eastern Europe was much more lethal than the collaboration in Western Europe, Southern Europe, and Northern Europe. Because in countries like France, Belgium, Holland, Greece, Norway, the Nazis found collaborators, and those collaborators participated in the first stages of the final solution, defining the Jews, marking the Jews, stealing their property, rounding them up even, and putting them on trains. But those collaborators didn't murder the Jews. I'm not saying that to condone what they did. Whereas in Eastern Europe, you had Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Croatians, who played a very active and integral role in the murder process. And you take a country like Lithuania, 220,000 Jews lived under the Nazi occupation, 212,000 murdered, 96.4%, and a very important factor is because of the extensive collaboration of Lithuanian Nazi war criminals.
They were brutal. They were brutal. I mean, I know that. My mom came from Lithuania. Yeah. That's terrible. Demjanjuk, where is he now?
He's in jail in Munich, awaiting the beginning of his trial, the opening of his trial, November 30th.
And it will be where?
It will be in Munich, in Germany.
Off the side a minute, we had this woman on who did a film on Kastner, the famous Kastner Trial.
Yes, I do.
Did you ever do any research? Was he guilty or not guilty? Nobody knows.
The question is, guilty of what?
I don't know.
No, listen.
Let me tell you, this story is very quick. It's playing now in theaters. We had it on 2 weeks ago. Kastner was the guy who made some deal with the Germans in order to save some Jews. He put a train together. Allegedly, he saved about 16,000.
1,684.
Okay, 1,600 Jewish people. One Jewish soul or one soul is enough to save, according to the Talmud, and you will agree with me. And so he goes to Israel, he works for the government, some fella takes a trial against him. Ben Gurion says it's liable, they go to trial. Shmuel Tamir, my former law partner, I was a law partner of his, took the case. This was his big win, and he's convicted in the lower court. In the upper court, the Supreme Court said he was not guilty and someone murdered him. And this is a huge issue in Israel. And only a guy like you who knows all the facts can give us the answer.
First of all, the case is very complex. Affect America, right?
Welcome.
Okay, no. But
you're now
the point is this.
You're not in Tel Aviv.
Listen, the point is this, that Kastner hoped that the train that he was sending out of Hungary with the 1,684 Jews would be the first of many trains. And he hoped that by saving those people, it would convince the Allies to allow this dialogue with the Nazis to try and save the rest of European Jewry.
Right.
There were no guarantees. But what was unforgivable that Kastner did was the fact that he testified after the war for Kurt Becher, a Nazi war criminal who had been involved in the annihilation of Jews in Hungary.
Killed him on his trial.
Exactly. And no one could understand why he did it. To this day, it's incomprehensible why he did it.
It's alleged in books, though, that it was done in conjunction with the Jewish, at that time it was, what do you call it, before the State of Israel.
So Jewish Agency.
Jewish Agency, yeah. Who knows?
Listen, I don't think that's the reason. I think that somehow they had forged some sort of relationship and he thought he owed him. Maybe I'm wrong, but it was a terrible thing to do. And see, that, in a sense, I think sealed his fate.
I know.
Had he not done that, listen, you can argue about what Kastner did. Kastner might have been a fool. He might have been the most brave person imaginable. But
he saved the Satmar Rebbe on that train.
The train was made up of the leaders of Hungarian Jewry and other people, many of them from his hometown, by the way, of Cluj. It was another factor that got a lot of people angry at him because they thought that he was saving them and not anybody else. But Kastner's original idea was to have this train convince the Allies that the Nazis were willing to talk.
You know, it's impossible. In the 70s, I worked for the U.S. Senate for a fellow named Vance Hartke. And really what I tried to do was and he allowed it, by the way, he's from Indiana. He allowed me to bring out Jews from the Soviet Union at that time. So I used to get petitions from people, this family, that family. It's the worst thing in the world because you can never play God. So I never wanted to know, and I never wanted to meet. I just got names, and I went to the chief of the OVIR, Verein, and I tried to move them out, and we did. We were successful in Minsk and in Kiev. And I never wanted to meet the people, because one of them could be a rabbi, the other a hooker. I don't care. I did it because I think this is the way you should do it, and we go. So when people had to make choices, and your first book talks about that very thoroughly.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
I know.
It's a natural association.
We're on the same level. But I chase secretaries, you chase Nazi hunters, so we got a different life here. I want the good secretaries to work so I can do my stuff. But you're doing a humongous job, and I guess you get tremendous satisfaction when you pin one down. It must be
Listen,
very
today,
gratifying.
Leon, today we got word that the Australian Minister of Home Affairs, Brendan O'Connor, signed on approving the extradition of Charles Zente, a man accused of murder in the Holocaust in Budapest, from Perth, Australia, to which he escaped, to stand trial in Hungary. Today, today news came down, and you can imagine how I felt. I invested 5 years in the case. And the information that I got came, believe it or not, from the brother of the person that he murdered. And when we started our Operation Last Chance project in Hungary, which offers financial rewards for information leading to prosecution and punishment of Nazis, he remembered, the brother of the victim remembered that his father, a lawyer who also survived the Shoah, had collected evidence against this person, Charles Zente, indicating that he had murdered the brother, Peter Balash, 18-year-old Jewish boy, and he found the material in his house, and he sent it to Jerusalem, and he said, listen, someone told us in 1958 that Zente was in Australia. I have no idea if he's alive. I have no idea where he is. Please find him and let me know if anything can be done. And I found him. I found him living in Perth, hale and healthy. And now 5 years of legal wrangling and shenanigans hopefully are over. And it looks like he's headed for Budapest to stand trial.
How big a staff do you have to work with?
Do I have to answer that question?
If you don't want to, you don't have to. Obviously,
Not big enough. Let's put it that way.
Obviously, it's very small.
Yeah.
All right, Effie, it's been a pleasure to see you again after 9 years. Hopefully, in 10 years when you come back, there'll be no more Nazis left, you know? Or you'll have
There won't be. Most likely not.
you'll have prosecuted them. Is this a book for everybody to read?
For everybody.
Okay.
Young and old,
Operation
Jew and non-Jew.
Last Chance. He's got a lot of kudos on the back of his book here, and probably very compelling reading, and I will read it. The next time you're in town, we'll talk about it. Tonight you're buying dinner for everybody because you're celebrating a victory. My staff is parsimonious. They don't treat us. Anyway, good to see you. Always a pleasure.